President Xi Jinping often brags about China's 1,000 Talents program, designed to bring cutting-edge research and technology to China through lucrative grants and co-production agreements with foreign scientists. Toronto Star reporter Joanna Tu is the author of China Unbound, A New World Disorder.
The 1,000 Talents program works to try to recruit foreigners to work with China, using the promise of a lot of funding, the commercialization of their research in exchange for them handing over their research, the rights to the government, which could be used for potentially military or economic or all of these means in service of the state.
That program can turn to espionage, according to Charles Barton, who attended university in China and served as a diplomat in the Canadian embassy there.
Often it starts small with matters which are perhaps more basic, and then over time the foreigners are often cajoled into transferring over classified materials to the Chinese state to serve China's overall rise to power.
A case in point came from Harvard University and the eminent biochemistry professor Charles Lieber. He denied to federal agents receiving any improper payments from China through his joint research programs there, until the FBI confronted him with this 1,000 Talents program contract, which secretly paid him $50,000 a month and $158,000 in living expenses.
Do you want to respond to the allegations at all?
How do you explain the charges?
Last month in Boston, he was convicted of tax evasion and lying to federal agents.
This is a small sample of China's ongoing campaign to siphon off American technology and know-how for Chinese gain.
Last January, the director of CSIS, the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, David Vigneault, raised the alarm about China's threat to Canada.
To be clear, the threat does not come from the Chinese people, but rather from the government of China that is using all elements of state power to carry out activities that are a direct threat to our national security and sovereignty. We all must strengthen our defenses.
The first big hint of Chinese industrial spying in Canada came with the story of Nortel Networks. In the 1990s, the dynamic Canadian company supplied about 70% of the world's most sophisticated communications hardware. They built this research facility near Ottawa and entered into a co-production agreement with the rising Chinese telecommunication company, Huawei.
Late 90s, we started to see some activities around Nortel. I was the chief of...
At that time, Michel Junot Katsuya was chief of the Asia-Pacific desk at CSIS. He remembers coming over to the Nortel headquarters to warn about the spying threat from China.
We had concern about some of the individuals, technicians, engineers coming from China for a long period of time, getting access to very sensitive area. Unfortunately, the reception was the very, very cold shoulders. We tried to warn them, but basically they almost told us, don't come back.
In 2004, a Nortel cybersecurity team discovered that the company had been hacked. Thousands of highly confidential company documents had been illegally downloaded. The hack was traced to China. Shortly thereafter, Nortel collapsed in a financial scandal. And Huawei took its place as the world's preeminent supplier of telecommunications gear.
It was a Canadian research, it was Canadian genius that sort of came out with all this, and unfortunately, it benefited very, very, very much Huawei. But the world's success came with a Canadian innovation that was stolen from us.
As the abandoned Nortel building was being renovated for Canada's Defence Department, microphones and tiny spy cameras were apparently found implanted in the walls. Canadian government intellectual property is also a target for China. At Winnipeg's National Microbiology Lab, Chinese scientist Zhen Gaochu was recently fired and marched out of the building by the RCMP after she was accused of secretly shipping Ebola and Henopa virus material back to China and filing for patents there based on Canadian research. No charges were laid, and the Canadian government has tried to restrict all information about the incident on the grounds of national security. What does that tell us about? Conservative MP Michael Chang says Parliament needs answers.
We know that People's Liberation Army scientists were granted access to the lab. We know some of the research at the lab was funded by the government in China. And so I think they're looking for any and all areas of vulnerability to be able to not only breach national security, but also to steal intellectual property from the research that we do here and in other democracies.
I'm glad.
Independent Senator Yun Pa Wu thinks anti-China hysteria is hurting Canadian research.
We are entering an environment in this country where any ties with Chinese counterparts are put under a magnifying glass and often deemed to be suspicious without the necessary evidence to show that in fact they are suspicious or even damaging to national interest.
Joanna Chu says the Beijing regime has turned Western anti-China sentiment to its advantage.
I think the Chinese Communist Party capitalizes on the racism and marginalization of the Chinese diaspora around the world to be like, so see, like that you're not accepted around the world as, you know, as Canadians, Americans. So you're Chinese. You should be loyal with China because we're your motherland and we will support you and accept you.
Australia recently tightened its security laws and expelled numerous Chinese scientists and students.
But we don't want to get eaten by any big fish, right? Doesn't matter who they are.
Former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull spoke about that at the recent Halifax Security Forum.
Ultimately, you just have to know who you're dealing with. If you are, in fact, in partnership with an organisation that's essentially a wing of the People's Liberation Army, then you ought to know about it.
The United States has arrested Chinese scientists and issued wanted posters for dozens of others in what is called the FBI's China Initiative. Former CSIS Director Richard Fadden says the Canadian government clearly has no interest in launching a similar crackdown on China.
If the RCMP came out tomorrow, plastering post offices as they used to do in the movies with pictures of people whom they thought were doing the sorts of things you're talking about, I'm not sure the government would be ecstatic. I really am not. Whereas in the United States, it's thought to be a good thing. They're protecting their national interest and their national security.
Well, our legislation with regard to the transfer of classified technologies to agents of a foreign state is much weaker than that of other countries. It's unfortunate that Canada seems to be a very weak link in our alliance of like-minded countries that are coming to terms with the threat of Chinese malign activities.
In a speech released in late December, President Xi announced the Chinese Communist Party was doubling down on its 1,000 Talents program. He said China would exhaust all means to recruit intelligent and innovative professionals from around the world, and that would allow China to become a world leader in science and technology within 2 decades. Terence McKenna, CBC News, Toronto.